Hello, Dr. Elwood and classmates. My name is Jonathan Salinas. Today I'm going to give you an overview on Chapter 8, Designing Games for Learning. This chapter was originally written by Rodney Myers, who is a consultant who focuses on online games and how simulations can produce learning engagement. It was also written by Dr. Charles Regluth, the author of this book, who is a prominent educational researcher and knows a lot about learning. So let's dive into why use games for learning. So I know as a primary school teacher, all of my students, they speak the universal language of games, especially now, it's current age of technology. My students play tons of games online, and they play games on tablet, on their parents' phone, on their phone. It's crazy. So, whether it's a physical game like with objects such as like Connect Four or chess, or non-physical games such as role playing, tag, hide and seek, or virtual games, my students are constantly able to immediately focus their attention when it comes to talking games or putting anything in a game version. It's important to note that games help with learning acquisition throughout various ages, not just my primary students, but myself and older generations and adults in general. Games work. So, why do games work for learning? Games capitalize on the relationship between action and cognition. Games promote social learning. This is not necessarily virtual games, but physical games as well. There's always a social aspect in it. Games enhance learner engagement and effort, and games provide a safe environment for learning and collaboration and creativity, and games are customizable. So, chapter 8 tells us about three universal principles that are embodied in games, whether, again, a physical game or virtual or non physical game. They all have these three universal components or principles. Each principle is interconnected with the other principles, and they all help promote learning acquisition. And the three that we're going to be talking about right now is vision, game space, and instructional space. So let's talk about vision and all of its pre-principles. So here you'll find a list of pre-principles or co-principles that help make up one of the three main principles, creating the vision for the game. It's useful to create a holistic vision of the game that you're wanting to produce, design, which will help you with important questions such as learning goals, authenticity, levels of difficulty, anything that's going to make up your game. You're going to want to have a big, clear picture, a big vision for it. All right. So we're going to talk about four of the co-principles on this page. Um, Here we have principle one, which is learning goals. You're going to be thinking, what will the learner be able to know, feel, and do? Because the primary purpose of creating games is to promote learning acquisition. And the learning goals that you create for this game should be in line with with the learning acquisition at all times. It's one of the main rules. All right, principle 1.2 is authenticity. So being able to promote real world examples. So students and myself and humans, you have a very good sense of memory when it comes to something that they've interacted with before. So basing games off of something that is relevant to them, something that is interesting to them will really help with learning acquisition. Moreover, the book talks about single player versus multiplayer games and how it affects learning acquisition and the interaction of the game. So that's really important because most oftentimes cooperation when it comes to games is key. Although students can learn in a single player game, they're going to get the most, I guess, bang for your buck when they're working with someone else, whether that's a virtual avatar or another player of the game at the same time. Principle 1.3 is levels of difficulty. So a game should be designed in a series of levels of increasing complexity and difficulty, which means this can be done by giving the gamer like unlocking features or points and adding more and more onto what's going on. It's important to know that the onset of game should encompass things that are very easy, things that are easily obtainable, and things that the player or learner can get fast. All right, so Principle 1.4, scaffolding and assessments. So this book talks a lot about the acronym KSA, which is the combination of knowledge, skills, and attitude that a player or learner has. So it's important to note what this is and embed the scaffolding, which is like levels of getting harder based on the player's knowledge, skills, and attitude. So when it's creating the scaffolding, it should be diegetic instruction. So that means it should not interrupt the gameplay. That means it should let the player go throughout. Or it could also be scaffolding that's non-diegetic, occurs when the game is paused and you come and tell the player, all right, stop, you're not doing this right. Let me teach you how to do it. So when designing a game, you're going to want to see if you want diegetic instruction or non-diegetic instruction. And you're always going to want the player to be in a state of gameplay. A state of gameplay is constant interaction with the game and a state of not knowing. Like, so for example, when one of my students is playing a game on the computer and something's a little bit too hard for them, they're not in gameplay. They're trying to figure out what to do next. When they're in gameplay, they know exactly what's going on, what their next steps should be. All right. So 1.5 feedback. So there are four types of feedback. There's natural consequence, which is initial logic of the game. So the game's rules are set forth. The player is able to read the rules, do the rules, and it's able to just go on with the flow. There's explanation feedback, which is an immediate review after the player does something wrong. For example, sometimes there's virtual mentors or check-ins. There's debriefing, which allows the player to fully go through the level or the cycle, and then after they've completed the level, they review what went wrong or what they could have done better. And then there's immediate feedback, which the player or the learner can choose to click on. And this can be seen as like a tip, or like sometimes there's a question mark button on the game, a virtual game that a learner can click and it'll tell them what to do next. Immediate feedback is often prompted by the learner. So the game itself isn't going to tell the learner what to do. All right. And our last principle is motivation. So there's intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. These motivations can be seen as gaining points or wanting to do better or being able to customize some sort of avatar for the player. Scorekeeping, which helps motivation, and it helps build confidence as well. All right, so now we're going to take a look at the second universal design principle, and this is game space. So once you transform the first design principle of vision, you get to the second, game space. So designers need to create a game space. They need to think of the architecture, the layout, everything that's going to go into the game. So game space is important because it also promotes game state. Like I said, constantly interacting with the game and knowing what's going on. When a learner or player is in game state, a system can constantly collect data, which will better help the player interact with the game. So a list of co-principles. There's 10 of them that we're going to dive into when dealing with the second universal design principle of game space. All right, so the first one is goals. So you're gonna wanna make sure that your game is comprised of goals. So these goals also help with motivation, and they help the learner and the player want to keep on playing the game. So the next one is game mechanics. So game mechanics are pretty much the way the game functions. They help the players understand the rules and they help them think of strategies on how they're going to want to play the game. After game mechanics, we have rules. So rules should be defined, clear objectives at the beginning of the game, and they should be able to be seen throughout the game that the player or the learner can reflect back upon too. So oftentimes rules of games when designing them are kind of based off rules of other games. For example, if someone's designing a game for a student to learn how to read, they're going to try to look at other games that are literacy-based games and try to get some of the same strategies and things that they use to incorporate their game. So, in short, other games produce future games. And then principle 2.4 is players. So, player, like I said, you need to think about if it's going to be multiplayer or single player. You need to think about the game dynamic. So, game dynamic is the way playing emerges from following the rules in the game space. So, game dynamics is when when a learner and player knows the rules, and then they can go on and make those rules into a strategy. So the book talked about um, game dynamics and relating it to playing poker. So a game dynamic of poker would be bluffing. So bluffing isn't mentioned in the rules of poker per se, but players can infer that bluffing is a strategy that's going to help them win in the game. So that's game dynamics. And then under game dynamics, we have game balancing. So game balancing is pretty much straightforward. It's the art of balancing the relationships between all of the elements that we've talked about so far to make the game holistic. Game testing is something that a game designer should do throughout the process of designing the game. So game testing is constantly and incrementally and systematically testing the game as you make it, making sure there's no errors, making sure that everything flows and is interconnected, and that all the instructional goals line up with the game space and the intent of what's going on in the game. All right. So now we're going to move on to principle 2.5, which is the environment. So pretty much what you think, it's where the game takes place, the structure, the dynamics, the physical, the physicality of the game. Something to really think about whether you want it to be virtual or physical, something that's probably the backbone of game creation. All right, and 2.6 is objects. So objects are important because it's something that the player and the learner interacts with, right? So objects can be physical, such as like pieces in a chessboard, or it can be non-physical and virtual, such as grabbing a box in an environment virtually. So objects are considered into, they can be developed into two states. So there's static and then there's dynamic properties of these objects. So let me give you a little more detail on what static and dynamic properties are. So, for example, a static property, the book relates it to if a player is playing a shooting game, um, the gun may only be able to hold a set amount of ammunition. That's a static, that's something that can't be changed. And a dynamic property is the current amount of ammunition that that gun holds, and that's variable depending on the player's interaction in the game. So, two very important things to think about when creating objects for the game, whether you want them to be at capacity or whether you want them to be at a variable. All right, so principle 2.7, information. So information can be gathered throughout the game by 5 different types. So avatars, which is the character that oftentimes a virtual game has, objects, which we just talked about, events, which can be seen as like levels, or it can be seen as different areas of the environment. And then there's the systems. So systems are the way that the game functions and works. Principle 2.8 is technology. So technology is everything that makes up your game. So whether it's going to be on a virtual network, whether you need data storage, whether you need a hardware, whether you need physical objects to be able to play the game, whether you need a certain amount of people, that's something that would be comprised of in technology. All right, almost done with game space. So all games, especially learning games for design, should include a narrative, a sequence of events, and that the player should assume the main role of the narrative. It's cool to think about different genres when making a game for learning. It really helps hook the learner or player into the game. I know especially my students love this learning game in particular called Dreambox. So Dreambox is math application software where my students log on to the tablet and they're able to work on different content areas in mathematics, but they are assuming the role of the avatar and they're choosing which destination they want to go to. And each mathematical component has a different theme, whether it's like a wonderland or a farm theme, and it really does hook the students on. That is an easy relation to Principle 2.10, which is aesthetics. So you're going to want to make sure that your game looks nice, that, like I said in the beginning, it may or may not have some sort of levels of realism, some levels of relatability to the learner and player's personal life. All right. So the third and last of the universal design principles is instructional space. And the core principles are adjusting, coaching, and instructing. So when creating instructional space, it's important that you make sure that your learning goals are clear with the game space and clear with your vision. If your learning goals are not in line with this, the whole intent and the whole purpose of the game is going to be failed. All right, so let's look at 3.1, adjusting. So adjusting is a way of assessing or scaffolding, and it's non-intrusive. So adjusting is when a player is interacting in the game and the game in the background adjusts what's going on because the current level that the player is at is too difficult. So I see this in action in my classroom when my students use the program iStation. So oftentimes there is back channel adjusting when the student is not being able to complete a specific level. So the application will time out and they will be able to scaffold and be able to bring about a level that's a lot easier for them to attain. So then they can work up to the level that they're not able to accomplish currently. So let's look at coaching principle 3.2. So coaching is kind of just what it is. So coaching is when the player or learner is interacting in the game and usually the game freezes, it times out, and when the task is too difficult, the players are able to learn from the coach and ideally move forward with their intended goal. And then there is instruction, so that's just in time training. Essentially, when essentially a teacher or a person, when they have enough feedback of their KSA, the knowledge, skills, and attitude, they can talk with the learner to help them move forward to the next phase of the game. All right, so we talked about the three universal design principles, but some of the co-principles in those three universal design principles require a bigger in-depth look because they are so crucial to designing games for learning. So let's take a look at those three. So the kinds of game mechanics, we already talked about some sort of game mechanics, but this is going into a little more detail. So we got core mechanics. So core mechanics is something that is fundamental towards the game. So core mechanics is something that should be taught at the very game. It's at the very core of the game. So I can give you a good example of a core mechanic in a driving game. So if the player does not know how to use the specific controls and the controller to drive, the whole purpose of the game is not there. So they won't be able to even get past the first phase. So gamers and players need to be able to know and master those specific controls in order to function throughout the game. All right, there's 4.2, which, sorry, not 4.2, we're still in 4.1, my apologies. There's compound mechanics, right, over here, compound mechanics. They're how rules apply to various features. For example, if the player is playing a shooting game and a driving game at the same time, they need to be able to learn how to interchange between the two simultaneously. So if there's layers of components to help function in the game, they need to be able to succeed and master those components interchangeably. Okay, then there's last on 4.1, there's peripheral mechanics. So peripheral mechanics are non-negotiable or non-vital actions. So for example, this would be when someone is playing an adventure game and their avatar, the character that they choose, jumps in the water of the game. The avatar, through the code or the background code of the game, automatically just swims without the player having to choose to swim or click a button to swim. It's just something that's part of the game, the natural flow of the game. So 3 very important mechanics to think about when designing a game for learning. All right, let's move on to 4.2, parts of game environment. So parts of game environment include the structure of the game, like it kind of like the technology, like where you're going to host it. Is it going to take into account of time, the dimensionality, all of the effects that go into making game environments. 4.3 are the kinds of information. So players oftentimes get information from objects. Remember, they can be static or they can be dynamic. They can get information from the avatar that they choose, the character that they're playing with. They can get information through events, such as various levels. They can get information from the environment of the game. So if something and the game, for example, if you're trying to count the apples on the tree and they see a bunch of different trees, they know that there's a bunch of different levels and I guess objects to look at. And then the system, so that's kind of just like the device that they're using or the application that they're using. All right. So now we're going to go to considerations for the instructional space, and let's talk about adjusting. So adjusting is like we talked about scaffolding. So difficulty adjustment. So it's kind of just simple scaffolding that is kind of like a way you design from easiest to hardest. So you're going to want to level the game from easiest on the start to the hardest as are able to interact and grow in the game. Artificial prompts or cues are just like tips that a player can click on, and automated task performance. That's very important. So automated task performance is an ability where the player and learner can see their growth. There's an option, whether it's a graph or whether it's a point system where they can see how much they've accomplished, how much they've learned. I know when my students are interacting with iStation, whenever they finish a certain module during their progress monitoring, they can track their growth over the months, which is the students love to watch towards the end. 5.2, kinds of coaching. So there's providing information. It's pretty much obvious. So you can coach to provide information, or you can coach to provide hints or tips. 5.3 is kinds of learning and appropriate instructional strategies. So a game to learn can be comprised of memorization skills, application skills, which is to demonstrate what the player should do after the player has made an error, understanding the natural process. So it allows the players to interact for an extended amount of time, and then it gives them feedback on what they're doing. And then their attitude. So the attitude is something that you're going to want to promote through motivation. So in conclusion, games provide a meaningful learning experiences for people and learners of all walks of life, of all ages. And as we discussed, there are 3 universal properties to designing games for learning. You need to have a game vision, you need to create the game space, and you need to create the instructional space. I hope you were able to get a better insight on how games for learnings are created. I know I did. I know whenever my students interact with Dreambox and iStation now, I'm going to be seeing it in a different light and knowing why the application is making them do what they're doing. So again, thanks for watching and take care.